Turn the camera on. Hey, happy Friday, everyone. I am broadcasting to you live from the SBN Mothership, where what I was hoping to do was run through a real short presentation on sustainability frameworks. I'm aware that we haven't had much time on the course so far to talk explicitly about sustainability and what it means for business. So this is an out-of-session catch-up, if you like, and the presentation that I was going to deliver last week. But there was so much good stuff happening that sometimes it's better just to let that run. Anyway, I don't want you to miss out, and also I want to sort of plant some seeds that we can then discuss as a group and that you can discuss in your champs clubs as well. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to talk about frameworks, sustainability frameworks. I'm actually not going to talk much about definitions of sustainability, and that's partly because it can be a bit of a thicket of weeds, if you like, and also is that what makes the difference, having a really precise definition of sustainability. Maybe it would be helpful. I thought just what I would do is, if I can just find the right, what I would do is share this definition, or I don't know, approach to sustainability, which is from New Zealand's own Rebecca Mills, someone who I'm hoping that can come in and speak to our course actually. And she says, what you can see there, sustainability is not a field, sector or risk to be managed. It's simply the line that separates regeneration from degeneration. So I quite like that. I'm sure you could find fault with it if you were looking for it. But like I say, I would prefer to steer clear of definitional discussions for now, and maybe come up with something or look at some stuff that's a bit more robust and provides a bit more guidance. So to that end, let's run through this presentation. It's only a real short one, and I'll leave you with some questions that you can discuss in your champs clubs. What I'm going to do is introduce 3 specific frameworks for understanding sustainability. And when I drafted up this presentation for presenting in the course, what I was going to get you to do was discuss the merits of the 3 frameworks, with particular attention to these 3 questions here. So how useful are they for society? How useful are they for an individual business? And if there's any shortcomings, and spoiler alert, there are shortcomings, then what do you think would be necessary to close those gaps? So because we're doing this out of session now, I'll leave you with some sort of revised instructions at the end. But basically, I'm going to actually provide my thoughts on answers to these questions, and then you can sort of interrogate that and let me know what I've missed, what I've got wrong, and what I've got right. So the first of the 3 frameworks is something that a group of researchers at the Stockholm, let me get their name right, Resilience Center, I think, came up with, led by Johan Rockström, who is Danish, systems thinker, and with a particular focus on sustainability. And so basically what he and his colleagues did was look at what the different ecological systems are, and biogeochemical, I think they use that term somewhere as well, that sustain our life, human life on Earth, human and other life. And they came up with these 9 categories. And then they said, okay, well, what are the boundaries for each of those categories that we don't want to go past, that going past will actually disrupt that system and therefore have implications for life on Earth. And so you can see climate change is an obvious one, but there's also plenty that I probably wouldn't have come up with at first blush. So that's really useful. And you can see they've also then gone and given a kind of score, or they've assessed the state of those different systems. And so the ones in red the flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, and the loss of biodiversity. So you might have heard sixth mass extinction event is how the current moment in time we're in is being described. And climate change, they're saying we're not past the threshold yet, but I think that's in terms of where CO2 parts per million are currently at, rather than what we've already loaded into the system, because obviously there's a real lag of some decades before what we're emitting today actually reaches the atmosphere and starts having the effect. So that's planetary boundaries, stability and resilience. Oh, they're saying that 4 of the 9 have been crossed. So climate change, they are saying, has been crossed. I think, sorry, it's that inner circle. So out of the green zone and into the yellow zone is when it becomes problematic. Okay, that's the first framework. Second one, donut economics. This is in some ways, it's an elaboration of the planetary boundaries. You can see around the outside, they've got the same nine boundaries, if you like, or system issues. And they're calling that, this is research done by a UK researcher called Kate Raworth, who several Greens MPs in New Zealand are actually really fond of this way of thinking about things. So we've got the ecological ceiling, which is those 9 boundaries, but she's also saying, okay, but hang on a second, just because we haven't transgressed those boundaries doesn't mean we're living sustainably. Actually, there's a social foundation or a floor that we need to reach to make sure that in all of those categories on the inside circle, people have enough access to energy, water, food, etc. So it's a donut because actually in between those two, in between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling, is where, and you can see it, the safe and just space for humanity is. So she's added the concept of, just reaching a just place. So society being able to actually take care of the needs of its members. All things I've explained. I'll share these slides, so no need to go through the text now. Just as an aside from, so I think that donut economics is a really interesting concept, and one researcher, this is a paper that came out earlier this year, actually went and started looking country by country at how we were performing in terms of reaching that social foundation, so providing for all the basic needs of society's members, while also staying within the ecological boundaries. And the news is not great. Here, I think, is the most important graphic or graph from the report. And you can see on the vertical axis, that's reaching the social thresholds, the reaching the just space. And on the horizontal axis is transgressing those biophysical or ecological boundaries. So you can see the trend line is pretty much straight towards the upper right. In other words, we are currently meeting social thresholds. So countries, this is on a country by country basis, countries are meeting social thresholds and at the same time transgressing those boundaries. So the more advanced you get in meeting those the needs of the population, the more we're also transgressing those boundaries. So that seems to be a fairly tight correlation. I guess if you're thinking critically, you could also wonder whether there's any causation in there. For example, it might be that wealth or GDP per capita is the strongest indicator of both reaching social thresholds and transgressing boundaries. So in other words, the two might be tied together, in which case, of course, the challenge we now have, challenge humanity now has, as well as each individual country, is working out ways to maintain or even improve those, the livelihoods and the welfare of people, while also drastically pulling back from those boundaries. So not necessarily cause for optimism in that report, but I thought it was a really good way of making that explicit. Now, what I've missed here, and this, I was having some trouble with this presentation. Yeah, okay. It's just not giving it to me. Okay, the framework that I missed and the slide that it won't let me go to is the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you've heard of, and they're increasingly talked about in business as well, which is something we're going to get onto really soon. So, Sustainable Development Goals, these are replacements for development goals, which ran, I think, from 2000 to 2015. And so the time frame for achieving these is 2030. So by 2030, what these goals are saying is that no place on Earth should be experiencing poverty. There should be no hunger, and so on and so forth. So you can see that whereas the planetary boundaries were purely ecological, these are very much social and, to a lesser extent, or a kind of lighter extent, ecological. So it's trying to give a more rounded picture of sustainability. I'm not going to dwell on these because we're going to come back to them later. So those are the three frameworks that I wanted to introduce. You might remember the first thing I wanted you guys to do was to discuss their relevance and their usefulness. But because this is a monologue rather than a discussion, and the discussion will happen later, I'm going to just give you my quick thoughts on their usefulness. So I think it's really important to break it down into usefulness for society versus usefulness for a business. For society, I think the planetary boundaries are quite useful as kind of a holistic measure of how we're doing. It doesn't break down that well by country because some of those flows are global, but you know, if we're talking about sustainability in its purest ecological sense, then planet Earth is the boundary. So I think that's a useful starting point. I think the donut economics does well to take those boundaries and then add in some useful society level stuff. And I think the SDGs, similar story, but a lot hinges. So there's a lot of hype about the SDGs at the moment, and a lot of businesses and governments are talking about them pretty constantly. But I think the devil is really going to be in the detail, and it's going to depend how governments and also how businesses relate to them and what they do as a result that will really make the difference. How useful are any of these frameworks for a business? Well, I think not really that useful. Despite the enthusiasm with which business has jumped on the SDGs, I'm not really convinced that they're meaningful yet. And let's get on to that. So I think they're pretty inaccessible is the word I would use to describe these frameworks from a business point of view. So what happens next? Some creepy stock photos for you. Okay, so I guess let's start with what's happening to make those frameworks more accessible for business. And there is some actually really cool stuff happening. So the SDGs are being translated into, no, let me rephrase that. There's work being done by these organizations to make the SDGs reportable. In other words, for an individual business doing sustainability reporting, it can not only choose the goals that are most relevant, and hopefully it is the goals that are most relevant and not the goals that it likes the most or that it can most easily contribute to. So there's work happening to develop reporting measures for each of those goals. I think that's potentially really important. National governments are potentially doing the same thing using the SDGs and also looking beyond the SDGs. So actually there are alternative frameworks that might be more country specific. So New Zealand, for example, the Treasury is currently developing its living standards framework, which a couple of weeks ago I was quite excited to hear that. I've since had a look at the discussion papers, and at least for the environmental side of things, it just feels like quite standard environmental economics. And long story, but that's my background, and I was never that enamored with that as an approach to environmental problems. I also think it kind of the work that the one blind spot of the SDGs is cultural, framing things up in a culturally relevant way. So at a national government level, we have an opportunity to do that in a way that speaks to Māori values and concepts, and not just take the global stuff and apply it locally. There's also, at a kind of more defined level, a more defined scope, there's this movement or initiative called Science-Based Targets, which is explicitly looking only at greenhouse gas emissions. But these groups that are listed there are collaborating to define, to come up with a framework so that businesses can work out what they should be doing on their greenhouse gas emissions, given that collectively it needs to add up to a certain emissions reduction pathway. So it's taking that high level collective aspiration and the target, and it's turning that into a business specific target. So I think that's quite exciting and promising as well. So I guess my conclusion here, and my thinking, is that these frameworks can be useful, definitely useful to define things at the level of society, and there is some work going on that is kind of filtering down. I'm picturing it like tendrils of a plant or something, filtering down to try and transpose or translate those frameworks into something that's relevant for an individual business. But I think the other part of the picture is that business best practice is also pushing out to try and relate to those frameworks. So I think there's still space in the middle, and I think there's no perfect answer, but the solutions are being sought from actors from both sides. And so what I mean by business best practice growing out to meet those frameworks, I'm talking about things like materiality, which is maybe sounds a bit jargony, but it's basically it's a stakeholder-based process that businesses can go through to try and identify the sustainability issues that are most relevant for them. And I think also it's not just sustainability related, it's the big picture. So it's the business issues that matter, the material business issues, which is where the word comes from, that matter for the business's long-term performance. And so sustainability is inevitably a part of that, but it's not necessarily limited to what you might call sustainability initiatives or concerns. So that's really important, and that is emerging best practice. So all the big businesses are doing that. It's a basis for all of the major reporting frameworks like GRI and integrated reporting. And it's also something that I'm hoping I can talk more about with the course, because it's really the cutting edge process that leads a business to understand which sustainability issues are important. So happy to talk about that further at a later point of the course. Sustainability strategy and goals, that they kind of follow on from the materiality work. So you actually use the materiality process to find out which issues the business needs to concentrate on. That's kind of the horizon scanning, what issues are affecting our industry, what issues are affecting all industries, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, automation, all of these things. And then the internal piece, the reflective piece, is how are we resourcing ourselves and equipping ourselves as a business to respond to those issues and to remain competitive or to use it to our advantage. So again, happy to talk through that. Like I say, I see them as the external and the internal sides of the same coin to some extent. And then finally, there's reporting. And I think reporting is, there's a lot of different ways you can approach reporting. And I think the questions that a business asks itself, why it's reporting, who its audience is, what it intends, to do as a result, or how it intends, how it will allow itself to be transformed by the process of reporting. Those are the foundational questions, and then that leads you to a certain reporting framework, or making up your own self-styled reporting framework. So again, I see that as a nice little chunk of the sustainability puzzle for businesses. Excuse the slamming door. I hope that's not loud for you. It's a bit windy in here. But so one possibility is that I can deliver a kind of short presentation on each of these three over the next 3 sessions of the course, and we can have a good discussion about each of them as we go along. Alternatively, some of them might not sound as relevant as others for your business or for your interest. So very happy to take your cues, and perhaps if you have a chat in your Champs clubs, you can feed back any priorities or anything that's most relevant to me. So on the topic of Champs clubs, let me wrap up with this. Obviously, I've given some provisional answers to those first questions, which is how useful are the frameworks for society, how useful are they for business, and what could be done to make them more applicable. But what I want to know is from you guys is what you think of those sustainability frameworks. Have I got it right that they're not useful for business, or actually am I missing something, not coming at it from an insider business perspective? Ditto, do we need the connecting pieces, so the translation of the frameworks into something that's relevant for an individual business? Are we still waiting for those, or are you at all convinced by my 2-minute spiel that actually business best practice is growing out to meet those frameworks anyway? Perhaps you're skeptical, or perhaps that's exactly how it looks from your business. So very keen to hear your feedback on that. And I guess if you do accept that idea that there is still a gap between those high-level sustainability frameworks and how businesses need to practice sustainability ultimately, what can they do in the meantime? Is it as simple as materiality, sustainability strategy, reporting, maybe some better communications around it, maybe some CEO level engagement around sustainability? Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on that last question in particular. So how businesses can approach sustainability right now, given that those high-level sustainability frameworks that have come out of academia and intergovernmental negotiations aren't necessarily ready for businesses to pick up and use. So I am going to leave it there. I perhaps spoken for slightly longer than I had intended, but hopefully it's all been on point. And hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully you've got some thoughts that you can share with your Champs Club and feed back to me whenever we next meet, which will be other side of Easter. Okay, till then, take care. See ya.